Although God would have brought the generation that came out of Egypt into the promised land, they had rebelled against him. And thus, God led them to wander in the wilderness until they died. Now, the next generation, is prepared to enter the land under Joshua's leadership. So, this brings us into a third section of the Bible story that we may call the promised land. God had been patient with the wicked people of Canaan, but the time had come for God to use Israel to punish those nations for their wickedness while also fulfilling his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we've been moving toward this point in the Bible story for quite some time now. But let's go back and remember a couple of things that we've already seen. Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16, when the Lord said to Abram, "Know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and they will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." And so we notice that it wasn't time at that point for God to give Abram the land of Canaan in this way, but that his descendants were going to be given this land. When when the sin of the Amorites, the people in that land, had reached its full measure, when it was time. And so we've seen now the offspring of Abram be oppressed in Egypt and be brought out through God's judgment of the nation of Egypt. And now it's time for this nation to come into the land of Canaan. Deuteronomy chapter 18, we might also read in verses 9 through 14 when we think about why God's punishing these nations, or about to punish these nations, as we're going to be seeing in the book of Joshua. It says, remember, this is Moses to this generation of Israel who were about to take possession of the land. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. No one among you is to sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery, cast spells, consult a medium or a spiritist, or inquire of the dead. Everyone who does these acts is detestable to the Lord, and the Lord your God is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable acts. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. Though these nations are about to drive out, listen to fortune tellers and diviners. The Lord your God has not permitted you to do this. So these nations were doing these things that God hasn't permitted them to do. These things were wicked and detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable acts, the Lord's going to give the Israelites their land. So, as we come into this piece of the Bible story, let's watch as Israel crosses the Jordan River. After Moses died, we see that God prepared Joshua to lead the people across the Jordan into the land he had promised to give them. In Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, after the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant. "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you and all the people prepare to cross over the Jordan to the land I am giving the Israelites. I have given you every place where the sole of your foot treads, just as I promised Moses. Your territory will be from the wilderness and Lebanon to the great river, the Euphrates River, all the land of the Hittites, and west of to the Mediterranean Sea. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. I will be with you, just as I was with Moses. I will not leave you or abandon you. Be strong and courageous, for I will distribute the land I swore to their ancestors to give them as an inheritance. Above all, be strong and very courageous, to carefully observe the whole instruction my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or the left, so that you will have success wherever you go. This book of instruction must not depart from your mouth. You are to meditate on it day and night, so that you may carefully observe everything written in it. For when you prosper and succeed in whatever you do, haven't I commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. God's getting Joshua and the people ready to be courageous, to be strong, to do what he says, and that it will go well with them. Well, Joshua then sent 2 men as spies into the land, particularly into the city of Jericho. And when they came into the city, they stayed in Rahab's house, who was a prostitute. Whenever the king of Jericho searched for them, Rahab hid the spies and helped them escape because of her faith that God would give the city to the Israelites. She told them about this terror that has fallen upon the people of the land, because she says, I know, in Joshua 2, verse 8, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and everyone who lives in the land is panicking because of you. That's verses 8, 9 area down through verse 13, and talks about all these things that God has done, even to the Amorite kings on the other side of the Jordan, and how they came out of Egypt. They've heard all of these things. And now they know that God's going to give Jericho over to them as well. And she pleads that they would show kindness to her as she hides them from the king there in Jericho. So a promise was made that she would be spared in the destruction of the city along with everyone in her house, down in verses 17 through 20, that whenever they come in and they take the city of Jericho, that she and her house, those who are with her in her house, will be saved. Well, when the spies returned to Joshua, they reported what happened and that God had handed the land over to them in verses 23 through 24. Then the men returned, came down from the hill country, and crossed the Jordan. They went to Joshua, son of Nun, and reported everything that had happened to them. They told Joshua, the Lord has handed over the entire land to us. Everyone who lives in the land is also panicking because of us. So they've seen enough to know God's with them, and God's going to give us this land. So early the next morning, we see that the Israelites left the acacia grove and went to the Jordan in chapter 3 and in verse 1. The people and Joshua were then to prepare for the crossing, as God was going to exalt Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and the Israelites would know God was among them and would dispossess the people of the land when the Jordan River was cut off. Chapter 3, verses 7 through 13 talks about this, that verse 10, for example, you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly dispossess before you the Canaanites, the Hethites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgasites, the Amorites, and Jebusites, when the ark of the covenant of the Lord of the whole earth goes ahead of you into the Jordan. And it talks about just further down from that then, that when the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of the whole earth, come to rest in the Jordan's water, its waters will be cut off. The water flowing downstream will stand up in a mass. Now, you might note that the Jordan was at flood stage at this point, as verse 15 goes on to describe for us. So this is not just some easy crossing where there's just a small trickle of water. But they would know. Joshua would be exalted before them, and they would know that God's taking them, going to bring them into the land. Well, when the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant touched the water stood still so they could all cross on dry ground. Verses 14 through 17 of chapter 3. When the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. Now the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvest season, but as soon as the priests carrying the ark reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water at its edge, and the water flowing downstream stood still, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, a city next to Zarethan. The water flowing downstream into the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off, and the people crossed opposite Jericho. The priests carrying the Ark of the Lord's covenant stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan. We also see then that memorial stones were placed in the middle of the Jordan River, as well as at Gilgal, chapter 4, verses 19 through 24. Well, after all of this, then, all the kings in the land were terrified of Israel, chapter 5, verse 1. The Israelite men were circumcised in dedication to God, chapter 5, verses 6 through 7. The Passover was observed at the appropriate time in chapter 5 and verse 10, and the manna from God ceased whenever they ate from the land. That God's been providing for them all this time, but now the manna ceases because now they're eating of the produce within the land God's been bringing them to. Chapter 5, verses 11 and 12. We see that they observe the Passover there, verse 10, verse 11. The day after Passover, they ate unleavened bread and roasted grain from the produce of the land. And the day after they ate from the produce of the land, the manna ceased. Since there was no more manna for the Israelites, they ate from the crops of the land of Canaan that year. The 40 years have now been completed, and the Israelites are in the promised land. But of course, they've got to take the land. They've got to conquer the land for themselves. As the Israelites had crossed into the promised land, they needed to remember all that God had told them about destroying the people of the land. You could go to Deuteronomy 7 and read verses 1 through 4. Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 through 18 says, however, you must not let any living thing survive among the cities of these people the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. You must completely destroy them. The Hethite, Amorite, Canaanite, Perizzite, Hivite, and Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they won't teach you to do all the detestable acts they do for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. God's been concerned that if they leave the people of the land, they're going to learn the ways of the people of the land. So, after crossing the Jordan River, the first city they came to was Jericho, which God had given to them. Chapter 6 in Joshua, verses 1 and 2, the Lord told Joshua, I have handed Jericho, its king and its best soldiers over to you. The city is fortified. They've shut it up. Nobody's leaving. Nobody's entering it. And Joshua was given orders to have the army march around the city wall one time each day for 6 days. Verse 3. And then on the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times while the priests blew the ram's horns, leading up to a prolonged blast and a shout by the troops in verses 4 and 5. And then the city wall would collapse. Well, this did in fact result in the wall collapsing and the people destroying the city, verses 20 and 21. So the troops shouted, and the ram's horns sounded. When they heard the blast of the ram's horns, the troops gave a great shout, and the wall collapsed. The troops advanced into the city, each man straight ahead, and they captured the city. They completely destroyed everything in the city with the sword, every man and woman, both young and old, and every ox, sheep, and donkey. So we can see God's provided in this miraculous kind of way. God provided the victory over this first city. However, then we keep going on. We see that when a small number of troops, about 3,000, went to the next city of Ai, it was a smaller place, they were defeated. The Israelite troops were defeated because there was sin among them, as a man named Achan had taken of things that were forbidden. Later, after they dealt with that sin and the way God wanted it to be dealt with, the Israelites then defeated Ai, chapter 8, verses 24 through 27, when Israel had finished killing everyone living in Ai who had pursued them into the open country, and when every last one of them had fallen by the sword, all Israel returned to Ai and struck it down with the sword. And so we can see about 12,000 people in Ai who were destroyed, and the city plundered a certain portion of that city according to the Lord's command he had given to Joshua. And so we can see God's giving this land over to his people just as he had promised to do. At this time, we see Joshua built an altar to God on Mount Ebal, as God had commanded in chapter 8, verses 30 through 35. It says, "At that time Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal to the Lord, the God of Israel, just as Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded the Israelites. He built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool had been used. Then they offered burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed fellowship offerings on it. There, on the stones, Joshua copied the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the Israelites. All Israel, resident, alien, and citizen alike, with their elders, officers, and judges, stood on either side of the ark of the Lord's covenant, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. Half of them were in front of Mount Gerizim, and half in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded earlier concerning blessing the people of Israel. Afterward, Joshua read aloud all the words of the law, the blessings as well as the curses, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read before the entire assembly of Israel, including the women, the dependents, and the resident aliens who lived among them." So we can clearly see that this is now a fulfillment of what Moses had commanded back in Deuteronomy 11, verses 26 through 32. So as they gathered in this area of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and Joshua wrote the words of the law of Moses on the stones and read the words of the law to the entire assembly of Israel, I want you to take a moment to consider the significance of this. This is the area that is known as Shechem. And this is where God promised Abraham to give the land to his descendants back in Genesis 12. Remember, God had called Abram, and he went with Sarai and Lot, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Genesis 12, verse 5 says, when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem at the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And now, here we are in the Bible story that now Abraham's descendants have entered the land and are conquering it, and they are laying claim to the land as their own. And from this point, the book of Joshua records other battles as well, as Israel conquered the promised land, defeating many kings in the process, with God even providing the victories. We see in Joshua 10, for example, how the Lord's working in this occasion. In verses 9 through 15, the Lord threw them into confusion before Israel. He defeated them in a great slaughter at Gibeon. We see how the Lord, down in verse 11, as they fled before Israel, the Lord threw large hailstones on them from the sky, that more of them died from the hail than the Israelites killed with the sword. We also see at that time that Joshua spoke to the Lord, sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon over the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on its enemies. And that there's been no day like it before or since, when the Lord listened to a man, because the Lord fought for Israel. So there's one example. You go over to chapter 11, you see more of this in verses 8 through 11. The Lord handed them over to Israel, and they struck them down. They struck them down, leaving no survivors, it goes on to say. Joshua treated them as the Lord had told him. And so we can see they struck down everyone in it with a sword, and completely destroying them, left no one alive. He burned Hazor. So we can see Joshua's doing what God said. God's providing the victory. God's judging these wicked nations as well, as we have seen. Joshua 11, verse 23 says, So Joshua took the entire land, in keeping with all that the Lord had told Moses. Joshua then gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. After this, the land had rest from war. God has been promising to give this land, and now he has given this land, as we have seen through the book of Joshua, in the early part of the book of Joshua. The time spent conquering the land in Joshua was around 6 years. You can calculate some time in chapter 14, verse 7 and verse 10. Next, after the land now has been conquered, now there was the dividing of the land. Although there was still more work to be done by each of the tribes to completely conquer the land, the work of taking the main cities had now been accomplished. Now it was time to divide up the land according to their tribal allotments. In chapter 13 of Joshua, as Joshua was old and advanced in age, it is identified this is the land that remains. And you can go through and see the various pieces that still remained to be conquered, to have these cities and so forth. The main part of the fighting had happened, but there was still more that needed to happen as well. And God says down in verse 6, I will drive them out before the Israelites. Only distribute the land as an inheritance for Israel, as I have commanded you. Therefore, divide this land as an inheritance to the 9 tribes and half the tribe of Manasseh. Remember, 2.5 tribes have already got their possession on the other side of the Jordan. And now this territory was to be divided. So the territory both east and west of the Jordan was defined. And then each of the 12 tribes received their inheritance, with the Levites being given cities within these territories. God's promise to give the land to Israel was now fulfilled. Chapter 21, verses 43 through 45. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side according to all he had sworn to their ancestors. None of their enemies were able to stand against them, for the Lord handed over all their enemies to them. None of the good promises the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. Everything was fulfilled. It's just very important for us to recognize God fulfilled this promise. He says he fulfilled this promise in giving the land to Israel. But then before we close, we see Joshua then gives a farewell address, if you will. As an old man, Joshua summoned all Israel with their leaders to Shechem. Chapter 23, verses 1 and 2. A long time after the Lord had given Israel rest from all the enemies around them, Joshua was old, advanced in age. So Joshua summoned all Israel, including its elders, leaders, and judges and officers, and said to them, and we're going to see some things that he has to say, but here's Israel gathered together, including its leaders. You can also see this in chapter 24, verse 1. And he reminded them of all God had done for them and how there was still more work to do. That Joshua said to them, I am old, advanced in age, and you have seen for yourselves everything the Lord your God did to all these nations on your account, because it was the Lord your God who was fighting for you. See, I have allotted these remaining nations to you as an inheritance for your tribes, including all the nations I have destroyed, from the Jordan westward to the Mediterranean Sea. The Lord your God will force them back on your account and drive them out before you so that you can take possession of their land as the Lord your God promised you. There's still more work to do, but you can do it through God. They were then to continue obeying all that God had commanded them and be loyal to Jehovah God, warning them of the consequences if they did not. Chapter 23, verses 6 through 8 says, Be very strong and continue obeying all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you do not turn from it to the right or the left, and so that you do not associate with these nations remaining among you. Do not call on the names of their gods or make an oath to them. Do not serve them or bow and worship to them. Instead, be loyal to the Lord your God as you have been to this day. Be loyal to God. Very similar to the messaging that Moses gave to the people before his death as well. Verses 11 through 13. So diligently watch yourselves, love the Lord your God. If you ever turn away and become loyal to the rest of these nations remaining among you, and if you intermarry or associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out before you. They will become a snare and a trap for you, a sharp stick for your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you disappear from this good land the Lord your God has given you. So watch out. If you go after their gods, you intermarry with them, God's not going to be pleased here. And he's not going to continue to drive out the people. We'll remember that as we keep coming further through the Bible story. After this, we also see Joshua telling them in chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. Therefore, fear the Lord and worship him in sincerity and truth. Get rid of the gods your ancestors worship beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and worship the Lord. But if it doesn't please you to worship the Lord, choose for yourselves today. Which will you worship? The gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living? As for me and my family, we will worship the Lord. You've got to choose, and the choices are not even. You must choose God, the Lord Jehovah God, if you want things to go well with you. After this, we see that Joshua died at 110 years of age and was buried. Chapter 24, verses 29 through 31. After these things, the Lord's servant Joshua, son of Nun, died at the age of 110. They buried him in his allotted territory at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Israel worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and during the lifetimes of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had experienced all the works the Lord had done for Israel. And then we notice after this is demonstrated, we see that Joseph's bones, which had been brought out of Egypt, if you remember clear back to Genesis 50 and verse 25 and Exodus 13 verse 19, that now are buried in Shechem in verse 32. Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the parcel of land Jacob had purchased from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of silver. It was an inheritance for Joseph's descendants. And then we see that the priest, Eleazar, died. And Eleazar, son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah, which had been given to his son Phinehas in the hill country of Ephraim. As we close this lesson with the closing of the book of Joshua, we see that God has now kept 2 of his 3 major promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Israelites are a great nation, and they have been given the Canaan land. We will wait some time in the Bible story for the fulfillment of the 3rd, that is the seed promise, but we keep looking for it. As we'll continue to see more signs, more indications of this promise and how everything comes together. While we close the book of Joshua on high notes of obedience for God's people, we'll watch then to see if this continues as we move along in the Bible story.